Hello developers. In this video we are going to take a closer look into the REST activity. It's going to be just about one activity, but it's an activity with a lot of options, so certainly worth to dive into. We're also going to look at different ways how to handle the result from the REST activity. But before we start, I want to do a quick shout out to Mockoon. They provided me with the ability to create a mock web server that we will use to simulate an endpoint for this video. If you are looking for a tool to mock a REST server, give it a shot. So with that out of the way, let's go over the options of the activity. And after that, we will implement a few examples to see how it works. Of course, you have your description and the operation, which is going to be the basis for any request. In the examples, I will cover the get and post options. Those are the ones that are going to be used the most. You have also your content type. This is information for the request on how to handle the result. This depends on the endpoint you need to call with the REST operation. In my case, it's going to be application slash JSON. The URL is the other part that is going to be the basis of your REST call. Of course, this is mandatory. How else are you going to know what to call? And then the body. Body is not needed in a get operation, but is going to be used in a post or put operation. This can be anything, a variable, a hard-coded value, or anything that's needed for your call. Parameters tab provides some extra options for you to add data to the request. Specifically the query and header options, which can be selected if you add a parameter, is for adding extra data to the request, and the URL segment is to provide some extra options on how to configure your URL. The authentication tab can be used to provide basic authentication with just a username and a password. Of course, this is somewhat limited, but there are other options to provide authentication. For example, the header parameter can be used to provide a bearer token. This is something that we are going to use in the example calls. And lastly, we have the connection tab that can be used to enforce protocols for a more secure connection, or set a timeout to prevent calls being stuck. And now for some examples. I created a local web server that has the route to get some users, and I will call this in the REST operation. This will result in a list of users that I will show in a simple form when I press the button Get Users. Let's see the results in our application. But you can imagine that most REST APIs use some form of authentication. In this case, I configured my Mockoon server to expect an authorization header with a bearer token. So when we try to get the users again, it will return an unauthorized error. To resolve this, we have to call another endpoint to get a token with basic authentication, and we have to use that token in the authorization header to authorize the call for the get users. So let's try to implement that in Codolex. I created a second flow called getToken. In this flow, I will use the REST activity again to call the token URL. That is the base URL for a Mockoon server with the getToken route. Content type also needs to be application/JSON. And for authentication, I can use the basic authentication of the component. And in my case, that will be local test user and Codolex user as password. This will result in a simple JSON with a username and a token. And to retrieve the token from the JSON, we can make use of the REST data source, which is a kind of memory data source. This allows us to save the JSON results in objects that we can use to retrieve the token. Let's call this data source Mockoon API because we are going to add more objects when we retrieve the uses. And here we can paste the result that we are expecting from our getToken URL, which is this simple piece of JSON, and give it a name, something like token results. Let's import all objects. And now we can use the JSON to entity activity where we can paste the response to get a token result variable. And then as results, we can use the create variable activity to retrieve the token as string. So let's use the autocomplete to search our token result, which is going to be this token. And then we can use the set variable as return for the flow value. And that's our token flow. And of course, we can easily drag our get token flow into the get users flow and give our response a name like API token to add this token to the authorization header. So let's add an extra parameter of the kind header and then use authorization with error. All right, let's see if this results in the users list while being authenticated. So now we have a way to get all the users with the REST operation, but it might also be a good thing to see if we can create a user with a REST operation. For that, I added an extra entity user with an ID and a username that I can create in the flow and use the entity to JSON activity for to get a JSON body to send with the REST operation. This can be sent to the create user route with the authorization and token, of course, and with the JSON body as string and the request body. So let's see if we use this flow in our application again, if we get a created user result. And the result is that our user with name and ID is created. And to show the other kind of parameters that we can use, we can use the REST operation again to get a single user. And this time we use the URL segment parameter to replace the part URL in the URL string with the value of our parameter. Define parts of the URL one time and use it multiple times, or store it in a variable and give it to other operations, and to keep our URL simple and clean. The other one is the query parameter that will be added to the URL, where we specify the user ID from the user that we want to get in the operation. So let's take a look at the preview of this code to see that the parameter in the URL is replaced with a value and that our query is added in the URL. So let's see if that results in our user that we created. And there is the user John again. The last thing I want to show is the Connections tab. I can't show an example of it working with the Mockoon API because that's a local API, but I can show you in the code how the result is going to look like. You can use the SSL or TLS options to ensure that the client that you are going to call is enforcing the right protocols, and make sure that you have a secure connection with the server. Or use the timeout setting to set the amount of seconds that the maximum duration is for sending data in the request. And in the result code, we can see that the send timeout option and the secure protocols are filled with the selected options. And that's it for this activity. If that was a lot to process, I would like to say take a rest, but otherwise, good luck with coding and see you in the next one.